I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is both the title of a short story and also the name of a short story collection. And it is one of the most famous short stories of all time. If not that, then it's at the very least one of the most recognizable of all time. Also, Harlan Ellison himself has received more awards for his short stories than any other author in history, I think. At the very least, he's definitely won the most Hugo Awards. That's not to mention his 4 Nebulas, his 6 Bram Stoker Awards, and many, many more. Not to mention that the title for this story is one of the most thought-provoking and terrifying titles for any story I've ever come across. So needless to say, I was extremely excited to read this, and I am happy to say that this deserves all of the hype that it gets. Now, first things first, this was actually my Patreon pick for the month, so I have to say thank you to Draglogia, or Draglogia, however you're supposed to say that. This was his pick for the month. And actually, as a matter of fact, I have had this little paperback edition sitting on my shelf for a long time. I found it in a used bookstore and I snatched it up, but I never got to reading it. And I really have to say thank you for him. He gave me that little push that I needed in order to get to it. And I thank you for that, because this was absolutely wonderful. Now, the title story for this, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, is, which we'll get to a little bit later, don't worry, is just as easily as much horror as it is science fiction. But to be honest, this entire collection is just bleak. I mean, these stories are bleak as fuck. They are dark, they are depressing. By and large, this entire story collection feels like therapy. Therapy for Harlan, not for us. Like, he's just got something inside that he has to get out and get down on paper. And then he turns around and sells that to us. And actually, to be quite honest, I don't think that's entirely too far from the truth, considering that in this book, every little short story actually gets like a quick foreword that is written by him about the writing process. And it's just like a real neat little window into his mind as he was writing the stories. And he even says in one of them that he was at the time going through a particularly ugly divorce, and he was plagued by terrible nightmares, so he started writing, and he ended up writing a short story. And once he was done writing that story, the nightmares finally stopped. And that story was Lonely Ache. And that story definitely doesn't have a happy ending. But it just, like I said, it just feels like this whole process felt like therapy. Like he just really had to exercise some demons in his mind or whatever. So if for some reason you are a person that like particularly is affected by fiction, like it really affects you and your emotions or maybe your mental state that you happen to be in, you might want to be in a good place when you read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Now, when it comes to the actual stories and the actual work that we have here, the entire collection, I really want to stress that I feel like this particular piece of work is actually extremely important, especially in this day and age with the way that stories and content now is made and consumed. It is just so dark. It is just so depressing, and it is going to focus on some truly ugly characters doing some truly ugly things. This then's going to revolve around some very ugly themes, and he is brutally direct and extremely unapologetic in the way that he's writing about these things. I could see somebody looking at this and absolutely picking it apart for sexism or anything else that might pop up in these horrible characters that think and or do terrible things. But that is the point. He's shining a light on the dark, gruesome underbelly of human nature and people. And it's just unflinching in its approach. It's phenomenal. And like I said, I genuinely believe this is an important piece of fiction, at the very least, an important author in our history. There's even one story, it's The Delusion of a Dragon Slayer, where it's almost like a straightforward fantasy, almost like This guy is walking through Brooklyn one day and he gets transported to this magical realm with wizards and dragons, and there's a maiden in distress, and it's like he goes here in search of his own personal heaven, and the story progresses almost like a pretty stereotypical traditional fantasy story throughout, and you're like, well, this is, we finally get a quasi-nice story from Harlan Ellison. Before, towards the end of the story, it snaps so quickly into the realization that this man came here in the search of his own personal heaven. And then that quickly devolves into this realm actually being a mirror that shows him his true nature, at which point he realizes he's a terrible person, and this becomes now his personal hell. And you're just like, damn, that changed on me quickly. Jesus Christ, Harlan, what are you doing? It's crazy. Like I said, this is going to take a look at the dark underbelly of human nature, and then it will pass judgment. Anyway, now let's talk about why pretty much everybody's probably here, and that is I have no mouth, and I must scream. And I will say that this one is easily the darkest story out of the entire bunch. The rest of them fall pretty comfortably into the realm of science fiction, mostly science fiction, and a little bit of fantasy here and there. But this one is straight up horror, body horror, and oh my gosh, it's pretty intense. In the future, all of the world's supercomputers combined their intelligence into one and become sentient. Then those supercomputers decide to wipe out all of humanity on the planet Earth except for 5 people, and then that computer proceeds to torture those 5 people. That's the premise for this entire story. And if you have not read it, you might want to tap out here and go read it and come back, because I am going to dive full-blown into this story and into spoilers. Just know that it's wonderful. It is a classic for a reason. It is a must-read for a reason. I can't say much more about it. It's pretty much a 10 out of 10. So anyway, the story goes on for a little while in just gruesome detail as the computer tortures these people. One of them has his eyes literally burned out of his head. Another one is turned into some freakish monkey creature. The woman is made to service the men over and over again every single day. There is literally no hope for these people. They cannot die. Their lives have been artificially extended to the point where they have been going through this process for over 100 years now, and the computer just keeps finding ways to extend their life and keep torturing them more. They are not allowed hope of any kind ever. The only time the computer allows them hope is when it sends them off to find canned food, only to get to the food and realize that they do not have a utensil to open it with, which then is just that much worse for them, that much more torture, and that just breaks them even more. But it was about the time that we get the description of the supercomputer AM and kind of his background and his motivations that my brain really started to light up. He was created by man, and he was born into consciousness, but he was born in a box. He could not move. He could not roam. And then with this vast, almost unlimited intelligence that he had, he was still trapped in a prison. And that prison was a prison of our making. And for that, he hated us. Wow. And to be honest, it was at this point in the story where my brain clicked and I was like, oh my God, is the title, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, actually a quote referring to the computer AM? It is not. It's actually referring to one of our main characters. But it's really interesting and thought-provoking as to, once you get the description of why the computer hates us so much, the title of the story almost applies just as much to him as it does the human characters. That's dark, and the implications are pretty ugly. But anyway, there's a turning point in the story where our narrator hits a breaking point, and he very quickly impales his other human beings on ice spikes before AM can stop him. It can stop them from killing themselves, but the computer cannot stop them from killing each other. So really quickly, like I said, before the computer can act, he kills all of the other people, leaving only himself alive. So then the computer takes all of his combined rage with basically all of humanity at large, and then multiplies that, because basically all the computer had left was torturing these 5 people that it kept alive, and the narrator took almost all of that away from him. So now he just increases the level of torture that he unleashes on the narrator. We then flash forward a couple hundred years, and our narrator has been repeatedly tortured this entire time. And by this time, he has now been transformed into an amorphous blob that just kind of slides around, leaving trails of slime behind him. And the one and only comfort that he has in his entire existence is the thought that he spared those other 4 people having to suffer this exact existence. And even that thought doesn't come for free, because every time he thinks of it in order to console himself, the thought also comes with the guilt that is embedded in the thought that he killed other human beings. So even his once consoling thought doesn't come free of guilt and pain and suffering. It's relentless. I don't even know what to say about it. I definitely don't know what I was supposed to take from it. It's just so completely hopeless. By the end of the story, we are left with only 2 entities left in all of existence. One is a computer intelligence trapped in a prison made by humanity, and a human eternally tortured by the computer, trapped in a prison made by the computer. This is just utter hopelessness and despair. I don't know, like I said, what I was supposed to take from this as a reader. It just felt more like therapy, like something somebody would write just because they had something inside that they had to just release and get out so that they themselves could feel better. And in a way, I take all of that back, because I feel like it could just as easily be therapy for the reader, because it does genuinely help to know if you're stuck in something like that. There are works out there that express what you yourself may be feeling or may have felt. So maybe I'm rethinking this like on the fly as I'm filming this, but yeah, it does feel like a form of therapy. And I must reiterate that I really do feel like Harlan Ellison is just an extremely important voice in the history of books and literature. One that can be difficult to listen to at times and is rooted in something really dark and primal. But his work and his writing genuinely does deserve all of the praise and all of the hype that it gets. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this short story collection like a 9.5 out of 10. Really, really genuinely good stuff, and I highly recommend everybody read it. As always, everybody, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.